din drøm. Og vær da ikke redd mens du sover, for natten skader ingen, og jeg lover, jeg vil våke ved din side og vokte deg i natt. Hi, welcome back to our reading of The Red Lion by Maria Schepers. And today we are moving on to chapter 16, The Woman Man, and chapter 17, which is The King's Friend. And before we start, I want to thank my good friend David Alexander, who's sitting behind the camera and helping out with the production. And I'll have a link underneath here where you can find his interesting series on infinite energy. So if you're interested in that, I mean, it's all about infinite energy one way or another, right? So check it out. Chapter 16, The Woman Man. I hope no one gets offended by that title. At last I found both a patron and a place where I could perform thorough, interesting experiments. In Hazenberg, under the patronage of Christina, Queen of Sweden. Much has been written about this strange woman man. She has been characterized as a romantic, a tragic genius, a madwoman, a perverted and debased personality, and a saint. Actually, she wasn't any of these and yet was a little of all of them. Undoubtedly, she was really a man whose eager, clever, and perverted curiosity had trapped him in a woman's body. The body he adored so much that he wanted union with it not only during the short swoon of passion, but for an extended time. He wanted to be inside the organism and listen to its nervous system, brain, emotions, and flesh. He wanted to live through her moods and concealed dreams, her malice and eccentric goodness, as no man has ever lived with a woman. It was in vain that he was torn from his mother's womb, suckled by his nurse, and pleasured by his concubine. The other pole was still an alien planet, light years away. He wanted to be a woman. This strange duality was the origin of that extraordinary schizophrenia that was so incomprehensible to the world. Christina possessed the male psyche and the peculiar instincts of a woman at one end, at the same time, though they alternated in strength. As a man, she was a serious scholar, searching for knowledge, and a skeptical, self-tormenting ascetic, though at other times she was a poet, lover, full-bodied drinking partner, and gourmet of spicy foods and sultry women. As a woman, she was a high-strung, whimsical creature who went to church and prayed. But most of the time, she was an unpredictable, hysterical, and cruel creature who routinely yielded to all of her passions. You never knew which entity would surface at what moment. What one built up, the other tore down. What one loved, the other hated. What one was ashamed of, the other boasted about. I have never seen a more tragic duality headed toward a more certain downfall than Queen Christina. Her weaker feminine nature desired power, yet power and responsibility seemed to choke her masculine impulses. The man within her rebelled and cried out for freedom, but the superstitious, vain, and hedonistic woman wanted gold merely for the sake of power. Christina needed gold, and Homonculus and I needed a workshop, a library, and freedom to work. Thus, Hazenberg became the scene of our exciting experiments. The Queen had to fight fierce battles for our sake, for her envious courtiers were threatened by my influence over her. But the fever took Christina just as it had taken me. Every researcher who goes into unexplored territory knows the feeling. She was lured by gold, but sometimes the other experiments intrigued her as well. As for myself, I was still struggling with my redemption and homunculus monomania. I wasn't in the least interested in gold. We spent many afternoons and nights together in the giant hall with its colored slate floor. Expensive spirit lamps hanging from the beams threw their strong light on a chaos of fired clay crucibles, water cauldrons, storage pits, mixers, fire tongs, containers of acid, pots of iron power and cinnabar, steam pipes and bellows. They were all over the massive table and piled on the shelves around the walls. We worked several perpetually burning furnaces at the same time, being careful to keep an even flame. We also used manure, which had been outmoded since Valentinus, because it generated heat through the decaying process. Crucibles filled with salt, sulfur, and mercury that had been purified by complicated processes and embedded in virgin earth lined the broad iron-covered brick furnaces like embryos in the mother womb. Each crucible was coated with wet steer manure, and the filtered heat of the evenly burning charcoal came up to it through a hollow brick dividing wall. We were trying to recreate the nursing warmth of the sun that filters down to the seeds in the soil. Each crucible contained a substance that was different in composition and preparation and was being maintained at a different temperature. The substances were to be born in 13 months. The queen turned out to be an astonishingly tireless famulus. She wanted to participate in everything, even the manual labor of lifting the tubs and working the bellows. Her strength and skill at these operations overjoyed her, and she tended the furnaces with an almost maternal devotion. Homunculus only allowed the queen to know about what was absolutely necessary, only the crude operation on the physical level. She had no idea of the importance of the timing of each so-called conception, so it would take place under the proper cosmic influences and constellations. She did not suspect that there was a relationship between my vegetarian asceticism and the operation I was performing. She knew nothing of the difficult concentration exercises I performed every morning at sunrise in my solitary room, working under Homunculus's direction. Her restless and intelligent spirit sensed that I was concealing things from her, and she was full of questions. I never completely satisfied her with my answers, but she submitted to the restrictions I imposed as conditions for her participation in my work. How much hope we had of each conception, how much excitement glowed around those red furnaces. We relieved the stage fright of those 13 dragging months by tending the 1,000 details of the workshop, puttering around with the fire, the manure, and the bellows. After the conceptions had taken place, we relaxed silently and extinguished the intricate, frightfully expensive spirit lamps. We watched the dark silk, star-dusted sky cling to the arched windows and felt the melancholy north cold that struggled with the heat from the furnaces. The new moon appeared in the window under the arch. It waxed full and waned slowly. 1 month had passed. During these first serious experiments, Homunculus's confidence rubbed off on me. It seemed impossible that the divine child should not be born in one of the crucibles, just like it was impossible that spring wouldn't follow winter. Homunculus had made the calculations, investigated the possibilities, and narrowed them down to 4 by the process of elimination. And these 4 alternatives were fermenting inside our 4 furnaces. One of them had to be the real solution. We were not disappointed when we opened the first crucible. After all, why should it hide in the first one? When the second one also proved barren 4 months and 2 days later, I was a little anxious. But Homunculus was undaunted. There isn't a single argument in the universe to refute me. He radiated dark certainty. We shall reach our goal in the next 4 to 8 months. But we did not. There may not have been any argument in the universe to refute Homonculus, but there certainly wasn't any transmutation either. The factors just didn't merge and transform as they do so effortlessly in nature's furnace. They stubbornly remained separate and unresponsive. Apparently, the universe was built on something other than thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. There was something we hadn't taken into account. Yet, in spite of all our disappointments, the only problem must be some missing element, something we didn't know about yet, but would discover. Well, we would search for it with tenacious and astute analysis. It could only be some missing nuance, some negligible but irritatingly important hairspring of construction. So we had wasted 24 months. So what? We would start over. And we did. Of course, our experiments were costly, and people are seldom patient of failure. Queen Christina held out fairly long considering her internal and external problems. She was always surrounded by slander and the scheming of her abundant enemies, some secret and some open. The man in her fought them haughtily, but the woman was scared and tried to bribe them with hasty gifts. Somehow, the level-headed ruler could never balance out the unbridled woman. Although successful wars enlarged her country by rich new territories and huge war indemnities poured into the treasury, it was always empty. And of course, the scapegoat for these problems wasn't hard to find. The infamous Burhus and his tame devil. Finally, the state council delivered an ultimatum to the queen through the mouths of an incited mob. "Down with the sorcerer!" they screamed. The three-cornered fight went on for years. Oxenstierna and the people on one side, and the queen on the other. Finally, the atmosphere became so charged that Homonculus advised me to leave to avoid physical violence. The queen bitterly accused me of plundering and abandoning her, but she was really glad to be able to end the conflict. She had wanted to settle it for a long time, but felt she could not retreat without losing face. She was already disheartened about ever getting positive results. The crucibles had deceived us again and again. Only distrust was conceived in their wombs, not redemption. No process at all took place in them. We couldn't even get the first phase, the so-called black body or caput corvi in Heisenberg. "It's the atmosphere of Sweden. It cools and innervates," Homonculus intoned with hypnotic conviction. "It is full of inhibitions and radiations that are inimical to the astral forces. We will have to go somewhere else. The circle's narrowing, but we need more conducive circumstances. Then we will try adding saltpeter and alum and using a different sublimation. We won't leave out the purified gold foils this time either. Besides," he continued, "we need a man in a man's body, someone rich and powerful enough to give us full protection. It is also vital that we acquire the unconditional obedience and blind faith of such a man in case we're slow getting results." All these conditions were fulfilled by Frederick III, King of Denmark. Chapter 17. The King's Friend. My semi-escape from the Swedish court was welcome enough for me with the Danes. They were always, and recently disastrously, at war with Sweden and were willing to give me shelter. My relationship with the Swedish Queen had been a topic of gossip in Europe for a long time. It had been thoroughly twisted out of proportion, of course, and a number of scandalous details had been invented around our simple and impersonal relationship. Denmark was fermenting just then with the decadence of the impotent loser. The Danes had lost their land beyond the Sund to Sweden under the peace treaties of Rosekilde and Copenhagen. Since they couldn't win, they hatched plots and schemed and made accusations and generally wasted their energy in squabbling. The whole country was divided into various factions that snarled at one another, as is characteristic of decadent societies. The loss of Schleswig had triggered the formation of anti-German secret societies, and the majority of the people seemed to live in a state of white hatred against the Swedes. Meanwhile, the nobility, especially the younger generation, took to aping Swedish customs. They proclaimed that their own ideas were truly liberal and cosmopolitan, and that there was an individual freedom that transcended national boundaries. What they really meant was that they would make no sacrifices for the common good. They were contemptuous of both the king and themselves, and their inner restlessness led them to indulge in all kinds of unnatural revelries, exaggerated fits of asceticism, and heretical religious extravagancies. Thus they roused the wrath of both the citizenry and the clergy. Finally, the general indignation produced a coalition that took action, that action being the royal law or Lex Regia of November 14, 1665. This law stated that the luckless and feeble ruler who had let most of the Danish Empire slip through his fingers was bound only by the Lutheran religion, the royal law, and the obligation to maintain national unity. Otherwise, he was accountable only to God. The imperial diet was abolished, and the government dependent, the bureaucratic hierarchy, and the standing army became the base of an absolute monarchy. Thus Frederick III became absolute king of an absolute kingdom, accountable only to God. I frequently thought that Frederick was an atrociously bad actor whom a wealthy patron had forced into the major role of a great drama, much to everyone's chagrin. He would gesture and sweat in his loose, over-decorated costume, making all the proper moves without the slightest belief in his ability to perform them. Even an indecisive commoner has a torturous time of it when he has to make a definite decision, and Frederick III had to make decisions and act on them all the time. Unfortunately, he could do neither. He couldn't even decide what to wear. He had numerous advisors, minions, astrologers, philosophers, scientists, and impostors around him all the time, and he listened to them all. Then he could not bring himself to accept the advice of any of them. Frederick III was an unfortunate and petty man. His monumental distrust of himself and everyone else was combined with boundless ambition and pathological sensitivity. Even before he was plagued with ill luck, he was a damaged soul, and his frequent humiliations had practically turned him into a madman. He regarded every word as an intended sarcasm and every smile as supercilious, and rushed to forestall the suspected injury by saying the wounding words first. He drove his whole court nearly mad by speaking for them and expressing disparaging thoughts he supposed they had. Naturally, their concerned protests sounded exaggerated or came out in the nervous stammers, and this upset the king still more. He seemed to have 1,000 eyes flashing in 1,000 different directions, and sometimes he was frighteningly acute. Thus he continually sought out ways to hurt himself, and these wounds never healed. Although it hurt him, he wanted to see that he was a monster in other people's eyes. The end result was that he was emotionally dependent on the very people he fought. He owed something to every living being in his retinue, and that total debt would have made a Mount Everest. He was always going to pay them back all at once and crush all disdain for him throughout the kingdom. Naturally, he wanted to be a wealthy conquering king, a famous and infamous giant of history, about whom heroic poems could be sung. Thus, Frederick III wanted the power of the Magus as well as gold. The fiascos caused by his clashes with reality had pushed him slowly into the world of fantasy. It was obvious why Homonculus had chosen him as both victim, patron, and patient. And although indeed we profited from the strange relationship, we gave him something in return: purpose. We made his unbearable life bearable, and he was finally enabled to do what he had never done before: trust, hope, and believe. he trusted until the very hour of his death. The three of us worked together wholeheartedly and seriously with no intent on the part of any of us to deceive one another. My demon and I gave that pitiful, self-crucifying madman many priceless hours of forgetfulness, and Homonculus allowed Frederick to know much more about him than he had allowed Christina. Once the king was allowed to see him after a period of intense preparation. The experience made him ill, but it made his faith absolute. He trusted us and our ability to succeed blindly. Long afterward, I realized why Homonculus had such a beneficial effect on the king. The man was but a pale, soft shadow of the demon. They were identical at the core. Both had intellects like descending spirals, denying everything and creating nothing. These traits in the king had destroyed all love, friendship, family relationships, and loyalty around him. He had poisoned all he touched with his malice and suspicion. Finally, there was nothing left for him in the whole world but the devil, Homonculus, and I. The person who best understood the king was a perverted old scoundrel named Hyacinthus. He had been thrown out of every major European country and had been in a dozen different jails for every crime from stealing to sex abuse. With scornful and malicious masochism, Frederick III had given him asylum. It was Hyacinthus's custom to tell all the weaknesses and bedroom secrets of the most powerful people in Europe, always in the filthiest possible way. His inner rottenness was a secret delight to the king. The fellow called himself a seer and a philosopher, but I suspected he was barely literate. He said his entire philosophical works were in one volume in his head. Physically, he was medium-sized and heavy, with feminine breasts and a sallow complexion. His thinning hair was fluffed out from a sloping head, and his face was marked with the signs of excess dissipation. He spoke in a falsetto, and his clammy hands marked everything he touched. Everything about him was utterly disgusting, especially his boundless arrogance. But sometimes he could be astonishingly original. Hyacinthus knew human nature. He openly did the mocking the king believed others did in private. He knew that he might dare it, that it was a sure way to dominate the more tactful and worried courtiers. It was what the king pitifully urged all his courtiers to do, but they all realized rightly that he didn't really want such things from them. What he really wanted was for them to tell him his self-concept was wrong. The end result was that he behaved like a jealous madman who tortures his mistress to make her reveal the name of her lover, and yet is scared to death she will tell him. Hyacinthus did tell him just that, and the king hated him mortally. But still he kept him at court and gave him a fine reward for every public impertinence. One such impertinence was a story spread about the reason the king didn't kiss women. The first woman he had kissed, the old leecher said, had closed her eyes in disgust. The second had stared in repulsion, and the third had blinked in horror. But all three had lied in unison and said it felt good. They all loved the king, but he interrogated them day and night until they confessed in exhaustion. Then he cried and raged and chased them away, declaring he was done with women forever. This tale was told in the king's presence, and the monarch managed to force a laugh. "Very good. I only wish I knew which one of those innocent lilies paid you to defend her before me. Or maybe you got something from them all, you old pimp." "That's about the size of it, your majesty." Hyacinthus insolently looked the king in the eye. His words fell into an embarrassed silence. The atmosphere became almost tangibly clammy, for everyone knew that three ladies who had ruled the king's heart for various periods and then vanished permanently from the court. "But you ladies and gentlemen mustn't let me shock you." Hyacinthus turned to the hostile group that was too horrified even to make a pretense of subdued conversation. The ladies I'm talking about bear only a superficial resemblance to real people. You see, I am merely talking about three aspects of our Lord the King. You will understand presently. Let me explain. Our most gracious ruler, who is subject only to God, is really like a powerful spirit that permeates not only his own domain, but also the souls of his subjects, admirers, and friends. Thus he can see himself through everyone's eyes, and think about himself through everyone's mind. No matter what we poor worms say, he knows what we really mean, for he is inside us, crowding out our own spirits. How else could he speak for us and refute our words of devotion? He says what he thinks, feels, and sees by looking out from inside our souls. You see, the ladies really loved and desired the king, but our most majestic Lord looked at himself through their eyes and was unable to feel love or desire. He has only one true enemy, a relentless and treacherous one, himself. Of course, it is superfluous for me to state that our most wise and gracious Lord is the son of my own spiritual and material existence. He added unctuously, and may God preserve him to save us all. Meanwhile, our work went on slowly, thoroughly, and expensively, but we didn't have to worry about opposition. The king covered our expenses generously, for we had become the focal point of his life. Homonculus knew well how to fling him some appeasing tidbit to reconcile him to the repetitiveness of our labors. His bedroom and study became littered with painted mottos written in prominent letters, things like, "Don't look at yourself from the outside. Get on the inside and look out." And "Opinions of others are worthless." And "He who would rise above all is alone and true only to himself. He uses everyone and trusts no one." Such phrases kept the king's disintegrating personality together. He would stare at them for hours, wrinkling his forehead in concentration. Then he would sleep as exhaustedly as though he had done hard manual labor. Often he fell asleep in front of the mottos and dreamed, and then I had to interpret the dreams. They were always nightmares in which he was being chased. He would hide in archways, climb endless spiral stairs, and crawl in chimneys. When he did this last, someone always lit a fire under him. He had only one pleasant dream that recurred frequently. He would be lying, helpless but calm, in a cradle, and a buxom woman dressed in dark clothes and smelling of milk would rock the cradle. Sometimes she would lean over and cover him with a blanket. Only the mystic powers knew why this poor mediocre man was born to be king, for his responsibilities were far beyond his abilities. Until Homonculus and I entered his life, he was so tormented by inner conflict that he was headed for mental imbalance and suicide. The two of us relaxed his tension, bolstered his confidence a little, and gave him a soothing sense of mental superiority. The poor man certainly had known no happiness from mistresses, friends, or family. We were the only ones who made him happy, giving him special exercises, studies, or manual chores that only he could do for us. He would putter around for weeks at these trivialities and forget his deeply scared self in the nirvana of healing, impersonal work. Homonculus decided our workshop should be some distance from the palace. We were given a bleak, uncomfortable house surrounded by a 13-foot wall that was 6 feet thick. The first floor and cellar were better equipped than anything we had ever had, for the king gave us huge sums of money and countless workers. My previous experiences had led me to avoid being seen in court. I came only when the king specifically commanded it or when he was ill. I didn't want to be around those prying, hateful eyes, but as time went on, I couldn't avoid it. The king became heavily dependent on me and involved me in his daily affairs to a much greater degree than I desired. But those first 3 years, I led a pleasant and secluded life with Homonculus in our little fortress far from the city. Only the king was allowed to see us. He usually came over in his coat at dusk and made his retinue wait outside, to their great dismay. He gave me an old couple from among his own servants, and they performed their duties with about as much curiosity as the stones in the yard. My living quarters in the cold, dank rooms of the second floor were furnished from the royal stores, but their heavy luxury could not relieve the severity of the huge chambers. Even the fireplaces looked like little rooms. Huge wood piles could blaze in them without providing any heat, because the wind sucked it all up through their monumental chimneys. My windows, set with fine, expensive stained glass by orders of His Royal Highness, gave on the unkempt park. My 2 old servants couldn't garden, and I didn't want anyone else prying around my workshop. So the grass ran wild, and the knobby trees leaned over weed-covered paths. That was when I began to see that these frozen figures were really like the moving forces of the astral world. I suddenly realized that the same symbols exist in our physical life too, if only we could decipher their meaning. Now, I began to see and hear the same intense emotions and imploring wails in the curving branches and trunks of the trees that I saw and heard among my internal astral demons. The difference was that the trees were mysteriously frozen on this earth, damned by the shackles of physical existence in time and space. And when they died physically, they would yet continue their emotional rage. Ever since then, mute nature has been audible to me. Now I truly understand trees. Some are muscular young rebels, and some are inordinately joyous, shouting odes to the sun. Some are indecisive and have a poor self-concept, and some are beggars that stretch their branches humbly for alms of light. There are also devious tricksters and snarling backbiters, tyrants who deliberately blot all light from others, haughty Puritans and gentle maternal protectors. Some trees are penitent hermits who eschew all decoration, and some are amorous and poetic. Some are peaceful, contemplative sages who understand and forgive everything. There are prosperous burgesses who produce a fine fruit crop, heavy-set peasants, and gloomy, cynical old men. I began also to understand the expressions on multicolored flower faces and the faces of the waters, the chasms, and the grim rocks that lie along the road. I found revelations in the crystals whose splits are occult designs. They talked to me through their facets. Observation of these facets told me all about them, what they were, and what they had suffered, just as today handwriting tells a graphologist. The elaborate workshop produced a series of elaborate fiascos. It was only the obstinate monomania of Homonculus that kept me trying. Not that I am lacking in tenacity. I was just beginning to feel that Homonculus was caught in a rut and that we were never going to get anywhere using the same old methods. Of course, I had no logical arguments to advance against my clever ally. I just had a hunch, what is politely called intuition. So I kept working under Homonculus's instructions. I did every experiment with precision, but with waning conviction. As time went on, I became more and more certain that I was performing useless work, wasting my time and changing the king's fortune into smoke that went up the chimney. Also, my body began to react adversely to my damp, cold quarters. I caught a cold and bronchitis, and rheumatism began to torture me. I was already over 54, but the king wasn't young either, and his unshakable perseverance moved me. He no longer patronized me for the sake of the gold I couldn't produce. He needed me because he trusted me, and of course, he was grateful for his relative physical improvement. He knew most of the credit for that really belonged to Homonculus, but the demon merely frightened him. He loved me. I reciprocated his friendship sincerely, for I felt sorry for his tragic loneliness. My illness scared the king, and he pathetically begged me to take care of myself. He gave me to understand that he wanted me to outlive him and refused to leave my bedside. Presently, he too began to sneeze and suffer from a swollen nose and cold feet, and I jokingly told him to leave before he shared my fate. Immediately, he accused himself of causing my illness and began to take action. This was the famous and infamous affair of 1670. Homonculus would allow us to move only if our workshop remained intact, so the king literally had the house lifted and brought close to the palace, where I was able to have a well-heated suite. There was a corridor from my rooms to the laboratory. This move kept many master builders occupied for months and cost a fortune. You can imagine what the hostile nobility, Puritan citizenry, and outraged priesthood thought about all this. Every court in Europe sneered, and lampoons were circulated all over the continent. I personally detested the whole affair. I felt ashamed for the king, and I would have loved to walk out on the whole business. But I would not let down the man who had a pathological fear of being ridiculed and yet risked it to please us. The remaining years I spent with this kind, unfortunate man were spent there as an act of charity, inspired by this consideration. I knew I would be through in Copenhagen the moment the king breathed his last. I finally left at dusk, just as I had left Milan, and once again the weather had magically conjured up a wet, windy October day. A slow rain drizzled, conveying that dark hopelessness northern rains always produce. The king's feeble hand had been scrabbling at my arm just a few hours earlier as he begged the assembled court dignitaries for mercy in that stifling death chamber. "Please, don't harm him. He's been everything to me. More than everything. I don't want. I command you," he had gasped. Poor man. Even when he was healthy, no one had taken him seriously. His relatives and the nobility who had been summoned watched his death agony with calm curiosity. They listened to his labored breathing and wondered when the doctor would pronounce him dead. No one felt any pity or love for the dying king. He was already superfluous. They looked to the new power. The room was full of people, but he knew he was alone with me, so he turned his face toward me, who had understood and loved him, and spoke in a feeble whisper. I had to read his lips as he formed the words. "Leave now. I can't protect you any longer. Quick." Suddenly, an odd, alien expression appeared in his eyes. He seemed to see my abysmal inner hell with preterhuman vision. And he spoke clearly one last time, his voice piercing and urgent. "Get away from him. You've got to get away from him. Find out his name, his real name. God help you." I took those words with me into the rain-darkened streets, for the two humble old servants who had tended me did their final service to their dead master by rescuing me. There were troops waiting to arrest me at the main gate, the side entrances, and the laboratory. The death chamber, after all, was hardly the place to effect an arrest. I knew what they were there for, but it didn't matter to me. The king's death and those shocking last words were so emotionally overwhelming that I didn't care about the future. Now I simply felt old and tired. I had wasted my whole life without getting any closer to my goal. If anything, I was further than ever. The body of Francesco Borri felt too worn out to start again, and I now realized that my alliance with Homonculus was simply a terrible burden that impeded my progress. It was of him the king had spoken. I was sure of that, but how could I get away from a demon who needed me, whose tool I was? The bridge was firmly established. I was his slave. Find out his name, his real name. I heard the dying man's words time and again. Undoubtedly, a glimpse of the all-knowing had been granted him. My steps echoed treacherously behind me in the broad corridors. Those conceited busybodies are waiting out at that gate to throw me in prison, I thought. But it doesn't really matter. Even if I'm free as air, I'm really in a worse prison than they could devise. Find out his name, his real name. But I did know his name. Surely it was... A stooped, skinny figure appeared from the shadows of the first column of the colonnade. He waved, and I followed him. We went down into the inferno of the palace, past the prison where my enemies had planned to drag me. The musty odor and noise of rats scurrying among the old stones brought back memories of another prison. I finally emerged from the subterranean corridor that wound right to the very limits of the city, and for a few moments I was happy in spite of the rain.